Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this sound effect, and I stop it really quick because I just can't stand to listen to a bunch of testosterone challenged guys jumping up and down because their team is number one, or they want it to be number one. And I show you this, more importantly than the sound effect, I show you this prestigious trophy which has been handed down from master bathers to master bathers for many centuries. I'm sure since at least, I don't know, the 12th century or something. This prestigious trophy, which we award to some lucky guy or girl who has provided so much pleasure to us in the bathtubs over the decades and centuries that we've given them this award. And today, we're here to celebrate the life and art of one of my all-time favorite bathing buddies, Oscar Wilde. There's a lot of reasons to like Oscar Wilde, probably, and to study Oscar Wilde about Victorian history and representations of different types of people and all this stuff. But we love Oscar Wilde because he's so goddamn funny and he's really hilarious and he wrote beautiful prose and he just had a really way about him. He was just a lovely writer in almost every possible way. So this is the most recent biography. I'll put a little link to my piece about Wilde below, as I usually do, by Matthew Sturgis. I believe it was published in England a few years ago and only just came out in England. There's a lot of biographies of Wilde, and I've read a lot of them over the decades. And I can't remember the names of them all, but Montgomery Hyde, didn't H. Montgomery Hyde write one? And there's several biographies of him. And they're always kind of fun. Even a mediocre biography is fun. But I think this is probably my favorite of all of them. One of the things about Wilde that's so much fun is that he was just so funny, and he was always saying funny things and doing funny things that you read about him, and he's just so charming. And he was sort of I guess they call him a raconteur, but he was also a networker. He was constantly going around introducing himself to famous people. Long before he'd ever written a word, he was kind of a professional networker who actually made good, unlike a lot of them. But that biography I really enjoyed. The first three quarters are just kind of funny and enjoyable and well written. And it's a good story. And the last quarter about the trials. I mean, I won't go into his life too much, but near the end of his life, he sued a man for calling him a pederast, and then he took him to court and had this big court hearing. He was actually supposed to be very funny and flamboyant and talented and put on this great performance in court, and eventually lost the case. And the Marquis de Queensberry, Wilde was hanging out with was in love basically with his son, Lord Alfred Douglas. And the Marquis de Queensberry, in retaliation, had him charged with pederasty and some sort of immoral behavior, and he was just humiliated in the trials. And they brought in all these kind of rent boys and men he was seeing, and they were paying some of them off, and they got him to give really just horribly embarrassing testimonies in the court, while Wilde had to sit there. And then he went to jail for several years, and he came out. In the last few years, he didn't really write after this. He was right at the height of his fame. The Importance of Being Earnest, one of possibly the funniest English language play ever written. I don't think there's a funnier play than The Importance of Being Earnest. And he just never did anything. That play was just coming out, and he just basically lost it all. And he went to jail. He came out for a few years, and then he just died in real pain and really poor. So it's a sad ending. However, we're not going to talk about the sad ending. We're going to talk about these wonderful, wonderful books and stories he wrote. There's other biographies of him. Many people think Richard Ellman is like the greatest biographer. He's good. I like this book. I enjoyed that as well. And we're just going to talk a little bit about what books you might want to read to take Oscar Wilde to the bathtub. Here's our martini. Stir it and shake. And we shaked it and we stirred it at the same time. And this is to toast the great Oscar Wilde. Now he was a big networker, almost to a shameless degree. When you read about him, he's just constantly going off meeting actresses and famous people and insinuating himself in their friendships and telling people he was friends with them. Some of whom didn't even like him. I guess he was always saying he was a big friend of Swinburne, and Swinburne didn't really like Oscar Wilde, I don't think, but he didn't care. He was just having a good time. So long before he'd written anything, he was meeting people. He was at Oxford. He wrote some poetry, which received a prestigious award. And he started following around the two most popular and well-respected Oxford dons in literature and arts were Walter Pater, whose most famous book is The Renaissance, probably, and the other one was John Ruskin. Both of them are really kind of interesting writers, and both of them were kind of fun to read in the bathtub, by the way. Walter Pater's argument in the Renaissance was that we don't look at Michelangelo to understand about what Renaissance visions of humanity were. We don't look at it to see how he explored the human form. We don't look at it with techniques. We look at Michelangelo and we judge it on one quality: does it give us pleasure? I mean, basically it's the bathtub, right? We're talking about the bathtub. Our whole bathtub philosophy is basically this Walter Pater guy, which is, if it gives you pleasure, it must be good. If it doesn't give you pleasure, just get rid of it. So he goes through all these old kind of, this light's kind of killing me. He goes through all of these famous Renaissance artists, and he just basically says, well, do they give us pleasure, and what kind of feelings do we get from watching them? Big influence on Oscar Wilde. And the term l'art pour l'art, art for art's sake, comes out of this whole aesthete movement in the late 19th century, which is, we don't look at art or read books to learn moral behavior or learn learn things. We're doing it for the pleasure of it. Ruskin's thoughts were a bit different, and I'll very, very, very summarily and inadequately mention one essay of his by Stones of Venice, in a book called The Stones of Venice. And his argument is that, yes, we want pleasure out of art, but just as important is the pleasure that goes into producing the art. So he says that the Gothic is interesting because all the craftsmen involved in producing a Gothic cathedral or a Gothic sculpture, they're all actually doing things that gives them pleasure. And that pleasure going into the art is a value that's itself. So it's all pleasure for both of them. Pleasure that goes into producing something. So if you write a book or produce a painting, if it gives you pleasure to produce it, that's good. It's a good activity. And if we get pleasure out of it, that's a good activity. And those were basically two of the biggest influences on Wilde. The other guy who was interesting to him, along with many, many other writers and poets, was Wiesmann. We talked about Wiesmann way back, in the Paleolithic age. I think we did our 500th episode. I think we did Wiesmann. And Against Nature, Au Rebours is about a man who's wealthy, and he decides to just kind of stay in his house and just do things that give him pleasure, however horrible. And it's a very well-written book. It's nowhere near as good as what I think is my favorite Oscar Wilde book, The Portrait of Dorian Gray, which you can see a real strong influence on this book. There's a whole section in the middle, in fact, which reads almost like a kind of a better version of Au Rebours, about when Dorian Gray goes off and has this kind of secret life of pleasure where he finds ways to pleasure himself in any possible way he can through art and through sex and through everything. And you all probably know the premise of this book. It's known as a classic, so you might not have read it, but it's a great piece of prose writing. It just sparkles. The language, like in everything Wilde writes, every sentence is kind of beautifully put together, and they just sculpt and sparkle and just funny and entrancing stuff. And even though it's about a book which sort of presumes to suggest it's writing about evil, because Dorian Gray really does sort of represent evil in this book, but it gives you pleasure, and that's the most important part. So the premise is that this artist paints a picture of Dorian Gray, who's this beautiful, beautiful young man. And Dorian Gray loves the painting, so he takes the painting and takes it home, and he puts it in his house so it'll never be ruined. And he says, I always want to look that beautiful. I want to look like that man. And some magical thing happens, and he never changes. He always is this beautiful young man, and everyone else ages, but not him. And whenever he goes off and does selfish things and horrible things, which it's suggested he does, it's never explained exactly, but he does harm people, and he breaks the heart of this young girl, and he tells her he's going to do something, and he destroys families. And as he does evil things, he's always Mr. Beautiful, and he's like one of the Trumps. They always have their faces look really nice. And the evil is all off stage, and all the evil comes out of the painting. This painting of Dorian Gray. It's a little bit like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is this respectable man who's in society. He goes through all the drawing rooms. He's very popular. But at night, he turns into Mr. Hyde, and he's just this horrible old guy running out chasing prostitutes and murdering people. He's a criminal. And the notion that there's this kind of daytime Dorian Gray and nighttime. And again, for a while, that notion of a secret life that no one else could see, is very interesting to him, too. He sort of, as he grew older, as he sort of explored the fact that he liked these young men and many of the young men liked him, he was starting to feel like he was more open about it, and he almost flaunted it a bit. He didn't hide as much as he probably should have, considering what happened to him. Anyway, so that's one of his great books. Of all the other books that he wrote, I mean, his greatest stuff is his plays. So if you haven't seen Importance of Being Earnest, I'm sure you can download or stream it somewhere for free. They make movies of it every few years. You can go to a high school version of it. You can go to a college version. I saw it many times, and I saw it on the West End a couple of times. You cannot watch the play without laughing your ass off. It's hilarious. It's nonsensical. It's silly. It's constantly surprising. He also wrote some fairy tales for children, which still just every sentence is lovely. Every sentence he wrote was really nice. Book of short stories you can find. Lord Arthur Saville's Crime has a wonderful ghost story in here, The Canterville Ghost. You might also want to get this is another book. You can just buy this book and then to see what you think of Oscar Wilde, the portable Oscar Wilde, because this has a couple of his plays. It has the entirety of the portrait of Dorian Gray, the picture of Dorian Gray. It has the critic as artist and some of his essays. One of my favorite essays. When I first read Oscar Wilde, I was an undergraduate at UCLA, and they assigned me an essay of his. I just basically read all his essays, and in one of them, he talks about how you can never nature. If you have a choice between nature and society, you should always choose society, because nature is really uncomfortable. It's really fun. And he says basically, have you ever tried to sit? Has nature ever created a place to sit that's as comfortable as a nice chair? And I remember sitting out in the sun trying to read essays all the time. It was so uncomfortable. Like, you lie on the grass, it seems like a good idea, and there's always itching and there's bugs on you and stuff. And basically, he's arguing the same thing. Nature never makes anything as nice as a chair or a bathtub. Nature is great for a lot of things, but if you want to really read, you need a nice bathtub or a nice chair to read in. And I've always thought that was perfect. He also wrote some wonderful essays. One of my favorites, and it rereads over and over again. It's just every time it's fun to read. The Soul of Man Under Socialism, and he basically makes the argument for socialism not as a fairness, as for fairness and for financial equity. He says basically, if people can do what they want to do, they can do things for beauty and for pleasure, and it will do their souls good. And I think he makes a great argument for socialism. L'Art pour l'Art, Le Bathtub pour le Bathtub. The bathtub for the bathtub's sake. That may be our new motto here at the Bathtub. Finally, I think that's all I want to... There's a lot of things. I could talk about Wilde or read Wilde over and over again. I wanted to just read a small passage. Whenever I want to give someone an idea of Wilde and his basic arguments and just the way he writes, I always turn to the preface to The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was wasn't a very successful book in his lifetime. It became successful later. He started off giving lectures and talking and being this flamboyant person. This kind of he's basically famous for being well known for a large part of his life, and he was always saying these funny, clever things. And then later in his life, he took all these funny, clever things. He started putting them into the plays and putting them into the books. And this opening, where he writes a preface, which is basically his philosophical approach to literature, which is borrowed largely from Pater and from Ruskin, but nowhere near as well expressed. It's just beautifully expressed. I'm going to read most of it. I'll probably skip a couple bits. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. That's it. Beautiful. That's all that matters. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. So when we see art and we read books, we don't give a goddamn about the person usually. Oscar Wilde's kind of an exception. But we just want to make sure the work is done. If the work wasn't beautiful, we could care less who the person is. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest, as the lowest form of criticism, is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. So corrupt and charming we can live with. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. And I'm going to just skip to the end. There's just a few. It's only a page. You can read it very quickly. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. Do think about that line. All art is quite useless. So we're not going to learn anything from it. If someone tries to tell you you're going to learn something from art, they probably don't get it. I think I wanted to read this at the beginning of every literature course I ever taught, but I didn't. Okay, is there anything else? There's so much to talk about with Wilde. I recommend the Sturgis biography. If I was going to pick one of these books to go out and get, you should definitely, if you haven't read it, you should get this book because it's got all his best. The Portable Oscar Wilde. There's many secondhand editions of it. It's got plays, poetry, everything. The only thing I've never really read of his is De Profundis, which is the letter he writes Lord Alfred Douglas when he gets out of prison, because it's just he's so devastated. I mean, he was really in love with this guy, and he just feels totally betrayed by everything that happened between them. And I can never get through more than 20 pages, but it's a pretty powerful piece of writing. But everything else I've read of his, I think I've read everything he's written, and I've seen most of his plays, many of which are available, I know. Okay, happy bathing, le bathtub pour le bathtub. Our new motto here at the Bathtub.